Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to our guest, Tom Linton.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. I know it's getting later in your day, so hopefully I will find a way to stimulate you with some of my observations. I'm just back from a trip to Asia last week where I was in Tokyo and Hong Kong, and I left and I think there was snow on the ground and it was freezing, and I came back and it's been almost 70 degrees, so it's great to be here. As was said in the introduction, I was most recently with LG Electronics, and some of you are well acquainted with LG because they do cell phones and TVs and appliances. And there I was the Chief Procurement Officer reporting to the CEO of the corporation and involved with many aspects of the company. But have recently decided to not stay on at LG. With Sarah Palin says she could see Russia from her house, I could see North Korea from mine. So basically decided that another 3 or 4 years in Korea probably wasn't the thing to do. So we ended up moving here. So actually we're just down the road south of Atlanta, and it's great to be in this area. My topic today, really I want to talk about is globalization. In talking to different people in the industry, professors, academia, I found a disconnect between the American view of globalization and what I have personally experienced by living overseas now for over 22 years. And not surprisingly, the view that we have here is very American. And we assume that other nations, companies, and people will be more like us and therefore more global from our perspectives. But I don't think that's true. So what I'm going to share with you in a minute has to do with a lot about my perspective on globalization and some of the major things that I believe underpin it. As Americans, we look at how many McDonald's there are in Japan and China, or how many Starbucks there are in Japan and China, and look at that as a measure of globalization. Or we look at, how many jobs have been exported to India or Mexico or China, and we look at that and we say, well, that represents American companies globalizing the world, or the mauling of America really becomes now the mauling of the world. But in reality, what's happening is in every country, in every culture, and in every company, there's a lot of different things that are driving different perspectives of globalization. And in a few minutes, what I'd like to share with you is what I call my top 10 lessons learned about globalization. So you really don't have to write anything down. I know some of you are taking this probably for class credit. You don't have to write anything down until I get to the top 10 lessons in globalization, because that's probably what you'll need to keep track of. But before I get into that, let me explain a little bit about where I'm coming from, because the perspective I have might be a little different had I been at different places at different times. So as mentioned earlier, I've spent pretty much my entire career at point in supply chain or procurement jobs. Now what I mean by that is basically every day I wake up, there's a crisis in my life. You don't have to go very far and past the front page of the newspaper to understand, if you've got a global supply chain, the extent of, say, LG's. I manage $40 billion of spend across 82 different company divisions, active in 49 different countries, 272,000 part numbers, 145 different products that go everywhere on the planet. And so any issue anywhere became what I would call crisis du jour. Political unrest, a coup in the Philippines or in Thailand, India threatening to use nuclear devices, Kobe earthquakes in Japan, China earthquakes, Taiwan earthquakes, unrest in various parts of the world, most recently now, of course, the Middle East, Icelandic volcanoes, et cetera, et cetera. All of these issues trigger disruptions in supply chains and how things are purchased. And I go back, for some of you who are new to technology, I was back in 1981, 82, when somebody said I was at IBM at the time, I spent my first 20 years at IBM. They were going to source a new product called a personal computer, but we didn't think it was going to be very successful. I was on a team that actually went to Asia and was sourcing components for this new device that everybody thought was going to be kind of a hobby, the PC XT and the PC AT. Obviously, I spent the next 10 years of my life consumed with that, moving to Japan, doing a lot of sourcing for the PC and the XT. In the 1990s, in the late 1990s, I went into the dot-com business. I created a supply chain software company, launched that, and obviously after 9/11, things changed very dramatically. And that's when I went back and purely became more of a commercial guy as a Chief Procurement Officer of a Lucent spin-out, then a Motorola spin-out called Freescale, and then LG. And so my perspective really is coming from that. But before I go into detail, let me just talk quickly about LG and about a Korean company, because primarily I was working for US companies that were located overseas. IBM, for example, is an international company, International Business Machines, that is located globally, American company. But LG is a Korean company, and it's very different in many ways. So when I first was interviewing to be the Chief Procurement Officer of LG, again, it's a $50 billion conglomerate, I was asked to fly to San Francisco to interview with the CEO. And many of you, of course, are going to be in interviews or doing interviews now if you're an MBA program. And I was standing in a French restaurant waiting for him to come in, and the maitre d' said, "No, we're meeting in the back." So I noticed as the guy was walking me to the back of the restaurant that the 3 black Suburbans pulled up in front of the restaurant. And out of the front jumped several people with earphones on, and out of the back jumped several people with earphones on, and they all had suits and white shirts, and then the CEO of LG stepped out of the middle Suburban. And they escorted him to the back of the restaurant. I said, "Oh, we're just going to sit in a restaurant." And I found out that the room had 1 table in it, in the middle of the room. And the LG had actually reserved the entire restaurant for the interview. And that was kind of the first signal that things are very different in a Korean company. When I landed in Korea, some of you may have been to Korea. I know I was talking to some of the staff and faculty. They have, it's cars and drivers and helicopters and planes. Private elevators take you up so you don't have to deal with any employees to your office. People carry your bag, and everybody stands up when you enter a room. So that's what I've been living in for the last 3 years. Very, very different than an American company where you actually have to fight for a parking spot no matter what you are in the company, including the CEO, and you have to kind of battle your way through the business. So I say all that just to kind of give you a perspective that starts with things are very different in different parts of the world. The things in the United States that are very casual, very collaborative, very social, in some ways innovative, that's very different when you work in a Korean company. I've spent 7 years in Japan, worked very closely with Sony, Toshiba, Hitachi, and other Japanese companies. Not that different than what I experienced in Korea. Very different in many different ways. So let me start with kind of a perspective about globalization that kind of falls back against that backdrop and kind of give you my perspective. And so now, students, your pens, you need them now. Top 10 lessons learned about globalization. So the first real lesson that I learned, and I kept track of these things probably over a 10-year period, and I started to do that as I was a Chief Procurement Officer in different parts of the world, because I began to realize that as I was trying to function and operate, it became very important for me to understand what makes you successful. Some of you may work for foreign corporations. It's increasingly likely now with how foreign corporations are globalizing into the United States. And it's very important to understand that if, I didn't speak Korean, I didn't speak Japanese, I didn't speak Chinese. There's so many languages to learn, you can't learn them all. And what happens is, I was dealing as a top executive in board meetings, right? I had simultaneous translation, much like you see at the United Nations. All meetings were translated simultaneous to me. And I would speak English, and it would be translated back in either Korean in the case of Korea, or Japanese in the case of Japan, or if I was in China, sometimes it would be in Chinese. And you had a group of people around you that were helping you communicate. And in the process of doing that, form of communication, you really lose quite a bit in the process. So my top 10 lessons really start with, number one, the common denominator of a culture is language. And human interaction, which leads to change. So if you're in there to do transformation or change management in any kind of company or culture, or if you're there to globalize the company culture, it requires clear communication for success. Several times during intense understandings, during translation of difficult company scenarios, right, I would notice that the interpreters would sometimes stop and not interpret everything that was being said to me. And it was very frustrating for me because on some points, I would actually have to stop the meeting or try to understand what was going on because the nuances of language are such that there was a lot going on oftentimes that wasn't spoken, or if it was spoken, it was said in such a way that it was very difficult to interpret. So if you're going to operate in a global environment, it does make sense to understand the language of that environment as best as you possibly can to be successful. Number two, culture is like the wind. Resist culture and it will go around you. And leaders cannot go faster than a culture's ability to accept change. And what I mean by that is oftentimes when you go into a company or a culture, you actually believe that you're going to make an impact or you're going to change what's happening. But it's like standing in front of a fan or in front of a strong wind. You think you're actually stopping it because you can feel it, but in fact, it's actually just going around you. It's just actually working through you and around you and going in a direction, maybe change direction slightly, but not much. It's going where it wants to go. And I saw many cases of different executives coming into foreign corporations and not understanding that and actually think they were making progress, but actually not making progress and failing. The third is globalization is not a one-way bridge. You can back up, you can slow down, you can change direction quickly. Most people think it's an inevitable march of progress, but if you go and look at what's going on in the Middle East, you look at what's happened in Eastern Europe, there's an ebb and a flow of globalization. A lot of companies try and overextend and have to pull back. And I think that as companies look at globalization, they have to make sure that they understand that it's a long-term commitment and a long-term process because globalization in and of itself is very, very difficult to do. Most successful companies, and I would put my experience at IBM as a very successful case, did it over 100 years. International business machines actually took it upon itself to actually hire and build international organizations. If you go to Japan and you talk about IBM, many Japanese, when I lived there, thought IBM was a Japanese company. They didn't know it was an American company. The same is true with McDonald's. Japanese in the room, they call it McDonaldos. They actually think McDonald's is a Japanese company. And I say that because I think that's an example of how not resisting a culture and actually being absorbed into it and yet maintaining your brand identity can be very successful. Number 4, trust. Trust is the only variable that allows a foreign idea to take hold. Not time, not money, not authority or experience. When I arrived at LG, I realized, because I'd lived and worked in Asia for a very long period of time, that I should do nothing for the first 3 to 6 months, or try to do as little as possible, but just build trust with my peers and with the other executives in the corporation. I had breakfast with them, I had lunch with them, I met with them, and the CEO asked me, after a week or two, what do you think, what are you going to change? I said, I'm not going to tell you anything for 90 days. And I spent a lot of time building trust. People who come into companies, and I've seen this over and over again, who don't focus on building trust first, and if you're hired by a foreign corporation and you work in a foreign corporation, understand that where high impact may be the mode of operation, if you're coming into a company that's in your own culture, if you're coming into a company that's not of your own culture, they're watching you, and they're going to assess you against a different criteria, and that is, can they really trust you because you're not from their culture? And if they fully trust you, they will enable you, you will become successful, and you will move on to greater and better things. But trust is something I found to be extremely important. Number 5, and if you remember nothing else from today, I really recommend you remember number 5, because for some reason this has been massively misunderstood. And that is that consensus can be taught. The management of consensus as a process is the best kept business secret of the East over the West. When Japanese children go to kindergarten, they are taught very early in their life the concept of nemawashi, which really means that before they go to the teacher with an issue, they have to form consensus amongst themselves of what the issue may be. If they have a conflict or a problem with somebody, they have to work it out. And I saw this again and again in Korea. I went to my boss, the CEO of LG, $50 billion conglomerate, 85,000 employees, a couple of times early in my time there, and I said, what kind of advice can you give me? I'm having some issues in this area. And he'd say, go back and work it out with them. Have lunch with them, spend time with them, understand what they want to do, and really constantly being told to work out consensus. I only did that 1 or 2 times before I realized that nothing can go up before there's consensus out. And what's very interesting is it's not human nature to behave that way. These are taught behaviors. They're taught behaviors in Japan, they're taught behaviors in Korea, and I believe in a lot of other Asian cultures, consensus is something that can be taught. And I think the West could learn a lot from just understanding the basic fact that it's not some type of mysterious cultural uniqueness. It's the fact that it's part of how, from childhood on up, people are raised. Number 6, ethics are relative to culture first and company second. Think about that for a second. Ethics are relative to culture first and company second. It's impossible to implement a global norm into a company if the culture is not accepting. When I first got to LG, I realized that they were lacking in a lot of the key, we'll call it the environmental green policies that the rest of the world had started to adopt. In fact, most of Asian companies are far behind European and US companies in the area of sustainability and adopting a lot of the, I'll call them more cutting edge norms that come out of things like the United Nations, the UN Global Compact. The electronics industry has a consortia. There are a number of different associations in certifications out there. Some of them country-specific, Energy Star ratings by the US Department of Defense, et cetera. These are all very unique to a culture. And it's very important to understand that until that culture is actually accepting of that change, a company can't just go ahead and make it. LG is a global company, sells its products all around the world. So what it sells in Europe has to follow European norms. What's sold in the United States has to follow US norms. But you can sell in China, and a lot of the same norms that exist in Europe or the United States don't exist there. The same is true with other countries, country by country around the world. So even though ethics might be something that certain countries or certain cultures want to espouse, it's not necessarily automatically accepted in any given culture or country. Number 7, and this is something I actually took from a Chinese proverb that says cost is like water. Water will always flow to the lowest point. If you pour a glass of water on the floor, no matter how flat that floor is or how flat you think it is, it will roll in a certain direction over time because the floor has a low point. It will seek its lowest point. And as a Chief Procurement Officer, I have been involved with many things over the years called labor arbitrage, where, when I was in the United States, we had a source in Japan back in the 1980s. We had to move things quickly to Japan in order to get lower cost. When I got to Japan, everybody said, you got to move it to Southeast Asia. We got to get it out to Taiwan and Korea because Japan's too expensive. I get down to Singapore. They say, no, Singapore is now too expensive. We got to move it off to Thailand. I get to China. I get to Korea, and now everything's got to go to China. But then just last year, I was visiting. I had about 500 people in China doing sourcing for our factories in China. And one of the people who is a buyer in one of my factories in China said to me, they said, we're having problems being cost competitive. Where should we be sourcing? This is in China. Okay. Should we be sourcing in Vietnam? Where should we be sourcing? Where can we get lower cost? And right now there's a big push in China to move away from the coast of China inland to China. So Chengdu, Sichuan province, even some talk about some factories are being built up in Mongolia, obviously Vietnam. The cost is like water. It's always a moving target. And job growth, which depends on manufacturing, must be globally cost competitive, independent of short-term government incentives, because what's going to happen is no matter what you do, Japan right now is losing all its jobs because they've all gone overseas. Well, in the 1970s and 1980s, everybody was sourcing in Japan. And now China is worried. Okay, so I think, until people actually grasp that truth, and people who are chief procurement officers are going to look at how do they reduce cost of goods sold and how we're going to reduce SG&A for those who are financial students here, those issues really are going to drive companies forever. Number 8, I talked about trust earlier. This is a little different. Number 8 is trust is what creates confidence, and confidence creates success. So trust starts with a commitment by management to employee security, and nothing else can replace it in human resources management. In 2008, it was a very dark day. In October 2008, recession, everybody realized that we were in for it. If you go back just 2.5 years ago, it was a very dark day. And so if you were in a major corporation anywhere, there was no forecast for 2009. Nobody would predict what was going to happen in 2009. The bottom had fallen out of the economy. How many cell phones were you going to sell? How many TVs? We sold 27 million TVs. Are we going to sell 27 million TVs in 2009? Sold 125 million cell phones. Are we going to sell 125 million in 2009? There was no forecast, none, that made sense. So the CEO had a meeting right after Christmas, day after Christmas, called everybody in and said, we got to hunker down. We got to hunker down. But he made a decision then which impressed the heck out of me, because I'd been in different meetings in different companies over the years. Sony had just announced a layoff of 16,000 employees. He said, we're not going to lay off anybody. We're going to get through this. We're not going to lay off anybody. And we're not going to lay off anybody because we have a commitment to the employees. And if this is a 1-year problem or a 3-year problem, we'll have to innovate, we'll have to figure out how to survive together, and we will make it through. I was amazed. And some of the other Americans in the room were quite amazed, given some of the other things that we had witnessed in our career. But the reason is because the trust between employees and management was so strong that the management was not willing to break that trust in the process of really facing a very difficult recession. Number 9, a management style based on pull always defeats a management style based on push. In Japan, my boss was Japanese, executive in manufacturing, and I was, at that time, probably in my late 20s, early 30s, very aggressive, push, push, push. Okay. He was in his early 60s, and he called me into his office, and I wasn't making much progress that particular week, and he put a piece of string on his desk. And he said to me, he said, what happens if you push that string? I said, it just bunches up, it doesn't go anywhere. He said, what happens if you pull that string? I said, well, I can pull it wherever I want to go. He said, pull, don't push. He said, tell your employees and tell your people, explain to them where you want to go and what great looks like, and help them get there. Don't push them there. Well, that changed my management career. I've been in management 27 years. But that radically changed the way that I deal with people. And now I'm more inclined with a group of people to say, this is what great looks like, this is what good is. Do you want to join me in going there and get the buy-in and the trust from them to go there and then lead them there, or help them navigate their way there? And when employees are asked to join you on a journey, chances are they're going to enjoy it a lot more, and you're going to get there faster. Number 10, and this kind of goes against some of the popular literature out there, but the world is not flat. The world is not flat. The world may be flat from afar, so the farther you get from it, the flatter it looks. but it's very bumpy inside a culture, very bumpy inside a country, very bumpy inside a company. And it's even bumpy but inside a company, inside divisions, inside departments inside a company. In other words, there's just a lot of differences out there. And I was constantly fighting fires and battles between different departments in different companies, between different countries within the same company. And so it's not as easy and as smooth as it looks anywhere. And I get a little frustrated when things get oversimplified, because if you work on the far side of the world and you look at the West, things are very, very different than they would appear to be. And I think the secret to success inside Eastern companies and Western companies is discipline. The one thing that I've noticed that is very, very different, and I don't know if anybody's here from Korea or Japan, but the dedication and the commitment and the discipline and the corporate culture is unbelievable. Much more so than I ever saw in a US culture. So I think that really is something, I don't know if that can be learned, but definitely it's a big difference from what I saw. So having said that, I just returned from Tokyo and Hong Kong last week in my new company, which I just formed in the last 30 days, which I'm very busy now talking to CEOs of other companies on how they can improve their supply chain and procurement operations around the world by getting into sustainable sourcing. And one thing that I'm realizing as I go through this process is how connected we are, whether we're in the apparel business or the technology business or the industrial business. There aren't many differences in what we do. And for those of you who pay attention to go back to the newspapers for a minute, but those who, if you hire a subcontractor and he's making blue jeans and he's putting blue dye into the Pearl River Delta in China, it's a big problem for that apparel company. Or if you're at Nike, or if you're at Han High Precision, most of you know the story in the last year about how the suicides in Shenzhen, employees were jumping out of buildings. I've actually been to this campus with 252,000 employees in one factory. It's a city. You go into Shenzhen, China, and you go to Han High Precision, and there's 252,000 people who work there. It's a city. They have their own fire departments, their own schools, their own hospitals. It's a company. And they're, statistically, I guess a certain number of people will have issues. But it became a problem for Apple and Dell and HP because of these suicides. And as I mentioned, about the issues I had with LG, dealing with cobalt in the Congo. Were lithium-ion batteries that use cobalt. I had to worry about whether children were actually mining it. I have to worry about whether 12-year-old children were assembling microwaves in China. The issues that are transcendent are universal. Whether or not you're working for a garment company or electronics company, there's a connection now on the social spectrum, on the environmental spectrum, which I think is going to be very different. And I think the world that we live and work in by 2020, 2030, many of you are going to be entering this workforce or working in this workforce, will be supercharged with these kinds of issues. We actually, I looked at some data. I was talking to both General Motors and Shell Oil about this as well, where, if you look at the data, people under the age of 35, when they stand in front of a TV or an appliance, actually think about its environmental DNA. Over 35, less likely. So what that means is that as people in the workforce, where their resin come from, where the steel comes from, where the raw material was mined, how it was mined, who mined it, how it was transported, everything from carbon footprinting on down the line. You're going to have to deal with these issues in ways that other generations have never had to deal with it before. Because I was dealing with it over the last several years. And it's only going to grow. The only difference now is there's a price tag difference. Generally, if something's going to go all the way through to recycling, there's going to be a $50 to $100 difference in that refrigerator. Are you willing to spend $50? If you go to Walmart and you're looking for a little refrigerator for your dorm room, Are you willing to spend another $5 for it? Or if you see one for $5 less, will you buy it? Right now, you'll probably buy it for $5 less. But if you knew that the factory that was making that was contaminating a river and killing the fish or causing health problems for a village in China, would you buy it? With social networking now, all that information is going to become so much more visible and so much more available to you as a consumer that it's going to start to change the way things are done. So I kind of look at it as business is like a river. You have to look at it from its source on up through to the delta. And if you really want to understand what you're buying and what you're dealing with, you have to go upriver, and you have to look at where everything is coming from. I think products will have a genome. I think that everything that you buy will, just like you talk about the DNA and the chromosomes of the human body, or you're going to see that in products. You're going to know, basically, all the way through the product's life, through its recycling, where that material came from, how it was made, who put it together, and how it was moved to wherever you bought it. And I don't think we're at a point now where we can pass off sourcing to contract manufacturers. I think the day is going to change. Companies are going to probably become more vertically integrated. How do you think Mattel felt a couple of years ago when they had to recall all their toys just before Christmas because of lead contamination? I think these issues are going to become more and more. They're front page issues, and they're going to continue to grow as time goes by. So finally, because I want to get to some of your questions, I want to kind of close with a few observations. Maybe a little bit more on the political side, but I'm going to give them anyway. I think the prototype for successful globalization has to do with benchmarking. Since I've been back about 6 weeks now, and I read the newspapers and I listen to various government officials talk in the United States about what's going on, it's a little frustrating because the United States needs to take a more global perspective about what countries are doing it well and which countries aren't doing it well, and we need to get more aggressive about benchmarking what's working out there and what's not working out there. If you look at, I spent 13 years in a little country called Singapore. Is anybody here from Singapore? Anybody here been to Singapore? Okay, a couple people. Singapore is a country of 5 million people. It has an unemployment rate of 2%. Think about the size of Metro Atlanta. Okay. How big is Metro Atlanta? 3 million? So let's just say greater Metro Atlanta, Singapore. There's an unemployment rate of 2%. It had a GDP last year increase of 12%. It had industrial production was up 10.5%. Manufacturing output was up 15%. Not many other countries are doing that. And they have 1 million visitors every month. Not from Singapore. Tourists. 12 million people visit Singapore every year. A country of 5 million people. It's an amazing, amazing case. And there are other countries out there that have done extraordinarily well in very difficult times. And I think, like a state or a county, you could talk about a county in Georgia or a mid-sized U.S. city, I think more needs to be done to understand what's working out there and benchmark it. And we have to stop being so anxious about our situation. And start really looking at what is working out there and benchmarking that. I started a company in Singapore. And I registered the company in Singapore. And then I went, after I registered the company, I went to the government. And the government basically went with me through the process and said, okay, we'll give you office space for almost no cost. Beautiful office space. We'll give you a deal, no taxes for 10 years. No taxes for 10 years, free office space, almost free. And any other help you need, we will help you. We will provide that for you. Okay? Only one thing you have to do. Hire people. You have to hire people. And you have to commit to hire people. Because if you don't hire those people, we're going to take away those incentives. And you look at all this job and unemployment issues that we're facing, I'm thinking, it's pretty common sense, right, the way that approach. You hire people, and you have no taxes, you pay no taxes, and we'll give you either free or almost free office space. And that drives the economy. So the employees, now the employees that you hire pay taxes. But the statutory tax rates in Singapore go up to like 20%. That's the highest tax rate in Singapore. And the government takes that money, and then they'll go invest in infrastructure and roads, and they'll build housing and sell that housing back to the citizens of Singapore at very competitive prices, which they then collect taxes on to drive the economy, to build roads and infrastructure and offer incentives to business. So this little engine called Singapore is unbelievable. And a good example of how a lot of countries and economies can actually emulate, and there are other examples out there. But so I think we have to be less fearful about what's going on out there. And I think we have to do more, we have to be a little less stuck on the way we've always done things and start to look at outside from a globalization perspective what other people are doing well. And if you think about this, everybody accused Japan, right, of copying the West back when Japan started to manufacture in the 1970s. Now everybody's accusing who? China, right? China copying everything in Japan, everything else. But maybe that's not such a bad idea. Maybe the business model is really understanding what's really working out there and doing it better than somebody else. And as I look at this issue and I think about it more and more, you begin to say, well, what happened to the United Kingdom? Well, in the 1800s, the United Kingdom was the manufacturing powerhouse, the most powerful country on the planet. But they got usurped because they didn't change. They weren't able to do that. Japan. Most people would argue that the latter half of the last century, Japan was a manufacturing powerhouse, very powerful, et cetera. What happened to Japan? Japan's been in decline. So I think what we need to do is kind of start looking at what works and then really get into the business at a country level and even company levels, companies in the United States, and benchmark what's really going on out there and then do it faster and better than anybody else. So with that, what I'd like to do is switch over to any questions you might have. I will kind of leave this with an observation that I think most of you probably could benefit by. And that is, if you look at the world today, how many inventions are there going to be that we have no idea of yet? I mentioned earlier that I was in early part of my career when the PC came along and I didn't know it was going to be important. I had no idea. When I started my career, there were no cell phones. There were no liquid crystal displays. There wasn't even CD-ROMs or MP3 players, but the inventions were there. The people had actually invented the MP3 file format. People had actually invented liquid crystal displays. People had actually invented cellular technology. People had actually invented these things. So what are the waves coming at you that you can ride? Because you're going to have things that right now, as we stand here today, that aren't invented. What are they? And so as you think about your careers and what you do and where you go, because I think most of you in the room, at least the average age of this room looks like it's under maybe 28 years old. Think about the wave that you can ride, because there's every generation has its opportunities, and I'm not sure that this one has clearly been identified yet. There's a lot out there. A lot of people believe the social networks and cloud computing, the internet, or maybe the next wave, but maybe it's not. The PC came out of nowhere. The cell phone came out of nowhere. And there must be something out there that's going to come out of nowhere. So as you think about your studies and you look at what's around you, remember that. So with that, I would like to take whatever questions you have.
You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation something about communication, and so I just wanted to take you back to that really quick. In some of the things that I was reading, I noticed that you at LG did a weekly video blog. And I was just wondering why you decided to employ that method of communication as opposed to just writing memos, and what the effect of that was.
Good question. I had about 2,000 people in my organization. In LG, about 600 of those were in Korea, and about 1,400 of those were out of Korea. And I found a couple of issues. Remember I talked about language earlier. And most people would say, well, he obviously did the video blog because he wanted to communicate with people who were outside Korea, right? Which is true. But in reality, because I spoke in English, when I did the video blog, people could back up, slow down. You know, it had a device on there where you can actually repeat it. So the Koreans would actually listen carefully to what I had to say because they could actually slow it down, back it up, rewind it, things like that. So I used it as a communication tool, but I recognized the fact that I was speaking in English and that for English speakers it would obviously make sense, but it also helped me deliver certain key messages internally that I wanted to do. And I did it weekly, and I kept it to 2 or 3 minutes just so that it was in bite-sized chunks that people could absorb. Like, for example, I mentioned in 2009, there was a huge change, or 2008, there was a big recession. We knew that was coming. Well, most people thought that that recession was going to last for 5 years. I mean, everybody, at the time, at the end of 2000, everybody thought it was going to last for 5 years. But I think one of the things somebody mentioned, Business Week actually picked up on this, or Time Magazine when they interviewed me last year, I can't remember, but in January of 2009, I figured I had to get underneath what was going on with this recession. So I flew upriver. I went up the supply chain. And I went to TSMC, which is located in Taiwan. They make wafers, you know, raw wafers, which are the chips that go inside the packages, which go inside the boards, which go inside the phones, which go inside the TVs. And I wanted to go to the headwater of the supply chain because I wanted to know what they were seeing. Well, while I was on the factory floor at the end of January, they told me that the demand was picking up. Cross industries, because they're a common denominator in the supply chain. So they do auto industry, industrial, electronics, et cetera. They said demand was picking up. The wafer starts at the front of the line were filling up. I flew back to Seoul, Korea. We had a board meeting or something the next day. And I was telling the CEO had just announced that we have to prepare for a 5-year recession. So as politely as I could in the board meeting with the other executives, the CFO and others, I said, I don't think so. I said, I think this recession is going to be over by the middle of this year, by 2009. Everybody looked at me like I was absolutely crazy. But I used the blog to communicate. I said, I'm going to pull in all the cost reductions that we have for the full year, all the contracts that we have, pull them all in. I want all my savings booked before we get to the half-year point because capacity is going to fill up, prices are going to firm, and we're going to be locked out of getting price reductions. So I used the blog to communicate things like that as a quick splash around the world. Well, as a result, I had a plan to save $4 billion in 2009, and I saved $6 billion in 2009 because I was able to time some of those communication, those decisions. So for those kinds of things, too, I would use it as a way of getting the word out to the organization. Yeah.
Moving from I guess a series of large companies to starting your own business, and throughout those companies establishing lots of connections and a network, I was wondering where you found within your own consulting firm your largest successes to be.
Well, I've just started it, and really what's happened is a lot of companies have contacted me and asked for my, I'm pretty well known in this particular space, so they've asked for me to come in and help them. And as a professional, you probably as a student you'd find this interesting, but you know, the fact that where you can work in, you know, garment manufacturing or electronics, or you can move around the supply chain and see different things, it's very interesting because there's one thing that's very true in supply chains. It's a lot, if you think about it as an ocean, okay? You got shrimp and fish and sharks. Who has more fun? You know, the shark, right? But it's also fun if you're on top of the shark and you're fishing, right? And so I kind of like, right now it's kind of fun to be the fisherman, right? To actually be on top of the surface. When you're in a food chain, the sharks generally call the shots, right? But generally the sharks can also be caught as well. So I kind of look at it as that. You know, you have to, if you go to work for a company, you know, think about what that company does. You know, if you're going to go to a company that makes shoelaces, you're always going to have to listen to the guy who makes the shoes. And you have, in my experience is the higher you are in the food chain, the more fun you'll have, generally speaking. The bottom of the food chain, it's okay, but it's more fun at the top because there's nobody above you other than the consumer, which causes you other stresses, as I talked earlier about the social, environmental, and economic issues. But that's probably, I mean, what I have found is the differences between the different kinds of things is really that. They all have merit, but they're all different. I don't know if I answered that correctly or not, but yeah.
Other than the language barrier, what was the hardest part about transitioning from living and working here to living and working abroad, and what did you do to prepare for that move?
Well, I'm not good at languages. I took Japanese for 2 years, and finally my staff said, why don't you stop doing that? And then I asked, but why? And I didn't realize this, but I was taking Japanese language lessons from a woman. And they said, but you speak like a woman. So I said, after 2 years of learning Japanese, I said, okay, that's it. I didn't know that there was such a nuance between genders, even in languages. So to me, and also, if you're working in international global roles, you learn Japanese, well, maybe I should learn Korean too, and maybe I should learn Chinese too, and well, I do a lot of business in Thailand, maybe I should learn Thai, or maybe I should learn Malay or Hindi, or German or French. I mean, there are a lot of languages in the world. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school and I've never used it. So, I mean, languages are important. I think if you're going to go work for, I saw Siemens on the wall here somewhere, if you're going to work for a German company, you might want to learn German, because if you're going to go over there and you're going to live, you're going to be more successful if you know the language. The more language that you know, the more successful you'll be in that culture and that company. I generally came in at a high enough level, for example, in Korea, where I didn't have to know Korean, but Americans who came in at lower levels really struggled if they didn't know Korean. I mean, it's that kind of thing where, you really need to have that level. It's like a touchstone every day around the water cooler. It's the whole dynamic that is important to you. It would be like in a U.S. company. If a Chinese person comes into a U.S. company, well, he better learn English if he really wants to be successful and move up the ranks and get promoted in that company. It's a fact of life, so it's just something you have to realize. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, you had mentioned earlier that you've been in management for over 20 years, and being an individual that just started my management career, I was asking, I would like to know how you marketed yourself from being just a first-line manager and and move up this chain.
That's a very good question. Everybody says, well, you start to act, the best advice I ever had was this. If you want to be a leader, you have to lead the business or it will lead you. Business is such, and the profit motive is so high in any company, that leaders are the ones that take the business and move it forward. And if you aren't willing to step in to do that, other people will do it. And you will be an employee, not a manager. Because leaders are managers, and they're the ones that kind of drive things. And then probably the other characteristic that I've noted over the years is that if you want to move up, don't act like your boss, act like your boss's boss. Don't imitate your boss. Imitate your boss's boss if you want to get ahead. Because those two things probably are more important than anything else you know. So drive the business, and don't look at your boss, look at your boss's boss.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for coming out. And I actually spent some time working in South Korea for Samsung. And part of my responsibilities there was managing day-to-day operations of 38 interns across different departments from different countries.
Fun.
And the big thing that I noticed there was a big problem in inter-department communication, where the bosses of those interns failed to communicate with me or reporting to me on what they've done or what issues were and things like that. And I was wondering if you've come across similar problems working in different...
Yeah, I try to touch on that, I think, in number 10, where I said, it's very bumpy. Most people think, everything's a well-oiled machine out there, but, an awful lot of square pegs get driven through round holes. There's a lot of force that comes into play, and their egos. So every department has got its own kingdom. And they're going to protect and defend the fort. And sometimes the job of an executive is knocking down fort walls in order to get teams to work together and collaborate when they don't want to. There's a natural tendency of human nature to protect thyself. And so a lot of times as an executive, I found myself in situations where I was like, okay, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this. And I want you to do this. And I want you to. So I sympathize with what you're saying, but there's no real magic to it other than a tremendous amount of you running around between the different offices and making sure that they're all behaving properly. There was a great commercial a few years ago by EDS. I don't know if you remember it. They showed it at the Super Bowl, I don't know, some years ago, about herding cats, you know. That's kind of sometimes you get the feeling that you're trying to get everybody to kind of coordinate their activities. So.
Terry has the last one.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't exactly know how to frame it to best get your wisdom on this subject, but it has to do with asking your opinion about best practices and gender around the world, and essentially the role of business, and would you have had the opportunities to be Chief Procurement Officer at LG if you were not a man?
You know, it's very interesting. Just today, I was looking at, there's a magazine, it's a European magazine. Actually, I think they're going to publish something by me next week, but it's called Procurement Leaders. And the blogger, one of the editors, said, I think the two most powerful women in supply chain and procurement, or two most people in supply chain and procurement now are women. One of the amazing things about, for the ladies in the room, procurement and supply chain, women do extraordinarily well in it. I think somebody asked me why that is, and I think, you know, I entered this not being an engineer, and I know I'm speaking at Georgia Tech, but a lot of creative, imaginative skills and a lot of soft side skills are necessary to be successful in procurement. Most people think it's all about, you know, green eye shades and hammering, you know, driving supplier costs down. But if you do that, you generally last about 2 or 3 years and you're gone. You've got to have the ability to manage the hard and the soft in such a way that you can win over suppliers, win over internal customers, win over your organization. It takes a lot of, call it more of the sensitive balance in business to do that. As a white male, I think, you know, I ended up kind of being successful at a time when I was a unique minority in Asia. I remember walking into my Japanese boss's office and I had something I wanted to start called a minority supplier program. And the Japanese executive said, "What's a minority?" And I said, "I am." I am. Because as a white male in Japan, I was a minority. I was a minority in Korea as a white male. Okay? So I think, you know, it's whether it be gender or race or religion, I think minority is a different perspective depending on where you are. In the United States, it's pretty clear what a minority is and what a minority isn't. But when you get in another country, what's a minority? You go into Thailand and there are minority tribes. You know, there was a book out there years ago called Tribes and talked about all the different dynamics that happen even inside a country or a culture. And I think that you know, two things. Two messages there. One is, I think in supply chain and procurement, women in particular are increasingly successful. Somebody joked it's because it has to do with shopping, but if you look at like Procurement Leaders magazine, it actually talks about it today. It talks about the two most successful maybe current candidates. I think one's maybe at Pepsi, another one's at Siemens, right? So you know, I think there's some good examples out there like that, but at the same time, it's all relative to where you are and who you are, and that was my experience in both Japan and Korea. I was a minority.
Tom, we thank you very much for your
Yeah,
time today.
thank you.
Appreciate your comments.